All right, well, welcome to another episode of Comic Book Squares. Here we are at Fan Fusion 2023. We're excited to have another interview. We'll kick the show off. My name's Shane.
I'm Paul. I'm Ben. And I'm Mike. Let's get this show started.
Welcome back, everybody, to the newest episode of Comic Book Squares. We're glad to have you. We are live from the Phoenix Fan Fusion 2023 in lovely Phoenix, Arizona, where it's only about 101 degrees. So we've been speaking with a bunch of talented creators today, and obviously we've got another one right here on the panel today that we're going to welcome. We've got Georges Jeanty. Georges has worked for Marvel, DC, Dark Horse. So welcome, Georges. Tell us, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on.
Thank you. I've been working steadily for about 25 years. More or less hit all the major and minor companies in that time. And right now I'm doing the Mandalorian for Marvel Disney. I've been very fortunate that I've been consistent enough to just go from one project to another.
Well, that's awesome. Do you like the continuity stuff more than maybe some of the more independent stuff that you've had a chance to work on?
Continuity in terms of...
you're working on The Mandalorian, that's a monthly thing, and some of the, so the Marvel and DC, it's every month, it's...
Ironically enough, and I know it's not the fashion these days, but most of my work has been monthly in this business. So I talked to George Perez once about that, and about doing monthly, because it did seem like everybody wants to just do a special, or everybody wants to do a cover, or nobody wants to do the meat and potatoes of the comic book. And in this business, I've always been that. I like the interiors. That's what I read. That's what I want to do. And for the most part, I've been doing, if not a monthly book, then close to monthly, or if it's been a mini series, it would come out every month, and I was on that schedule just maybe 3 months prior to its debut. So I've always, in theory, been a monthly artist.
I guess what kind of jumped out to me was the Wildstorm stuff that you had done, the American Way. And I know that goes back a little bit, and that was a limited series or a mini series. But I don't know if folks are that familiar with it, because it came a little earlier in your career.
Yeah, you already have that a little bit. It came in around 2006, so I guess around the middle or so of my career.
Okay.
Funny enough, I was doing the Majestic before that, which was also a while. And I think that's what led me to the association with the people at Wildstorm, and then later down the line, when the American Way became available, they were like, "Hey, didn't we know somebody? That's some work for us." And John Ridley, the writer, and the big guy, writer, director, and the Hollywood, he had seen some of my work and said, "Yeah, I really like this guy. Let's definitely go with that." So I've been very fortunate in my career, because ironically enough, it was the American Way that Joss Whedon was reading when he thought to himself, "Hey, I want to do Buffy again."
Really?
And when it came down to picking an artist, they said, "I don't know who this guy is, but I really love this series. I think he would be really good for Buffy." So my career has been a bunch of that, this leading to this, leading to that. So I've stayed consistent, and that's why I feel more that I've been a monthly artist, because that consistency has just been hopping from title to title, regardless of the company itself.
Yeah.
I've been best working there.
It's the best. You're just doing
it. Almost 30 years later, and I'm still working.
Wow.
So it's that with that work, that cadence of work, is that something where we hear sometimes where you, again, just other people are outside of maybe that title that you're working on at the time, are reaching out to you saying, "Hey, do you have the availability to work on this project?" And there's others that are like, "I'm always sending out, again, some of my work to other folks, and maybe other publishers, to see if they want to, bring me on board." I mean, how has that experience been for you?
Well, and as I'm sure you guys know, this business is such a small pond in the game of publishing. It really is very small. Even today, whereas we have so much visibility and popularity with the movies and all that, it is still very much a very small pond. And I think in that, you know people, you get to know people. And I've known artists who say they have representatives. And I always thought, wow, that's really cool. Somebody who reps you, they will go find the work for you and all you have to do is sit and draw, and that's great. But then the flip side of that had always been, you don't get to foster the relationships with the editors, and still to this day, that's how you get work. Is talking to editors and them knowing who you are and them knowing what you're capable of. And I always thought, God, with a rep, they know the rep and they're probably buddies with them, but they don't know who you are. So when it comes down to them having to choose a title, it may be you or it may be that guy like, hey, I was really sitting with so-and-so and we had a drink and God, the guy's reliable and he's all this. And I'm always going to go with the guy I know personally.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think to piggyback off that, it's I think harder in today's era because of all the digital force that's out there. It's almost like an email versus a handwritten letter.
Yeah.
You get very, you step back with a handwritten letter because they don't do that anymore. So to your point, instead of all these reps and all these face-to-face people representing, you being the artist and the talent going out there yourself, and having those relationships, that's got to be freshening, fresh.
Yeah, and legitimately, it's a different playing field. I don't pretend to begrudge anybody who has it in this day and age, how they're going about getting comic books. But back, and I guess once you get old enough, you get the opportunity to say, back in the day, it was very different. I was listening to you talking to Dan Pinozzi, and you had to go to the con and see the editors, and they had to look at your portfolio, and you had to keep it consistent, and they were always telling you, do at least 5 pages every 6 months and see how well your work has progressed from there. And that was the tools of this particular trade, if you wanted to go in the comics, that you had to adhere to. And yeah, nowadays, if you've got your own little website and you can upload an image every day and it gets 100,000 followers, they'll probably contact you saying, hey, we'd love to do Spider-Man because we want your followers to come and buy our comic.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump back a little bit. So we've been talking about the consistency of your careers, like in the months and all that. What was the first step? What was your first foray into college that then kind of kicked off?
Well, I'll tell you my faux pas, which I was breaking into the, and I always say that because I was breaking into this business in the 90s, around 94, right around the time that Image exploded. And there's the whole Image boom, and there's the whole chromium covers, and there's all that stuff going on. And of course, you see collectively what the style of Image was. And regardless of whether or not you like it or you didn't, that's what was selling comics at the time. My stuff looked nothing like Image. I thought more and more, I was working at a comic shop at the time and looking at these books coming in every Wednesday going, I am never going to work in comics because my stuff just doesn't look like this. I thought the best I could do, because at the time DC was doing their Vertigo title. And I thought the best I could ever do was just maybe do a Vertigo book and leave it at that, because I'll just never get a Spider-Man or an X-Men or anything like that, because my stuff, because of course once those guys left, they replaced them with people who pretty much looked like Image, and that was the whole push for I guess right up until the 2000s that people wanted to see. And man, I was sweating at that time because and it wasn't that I didn't like it. I did like some of it, but again, I was more about the meat and potatoes of this, and it just seemed to me that, for the most part, and please send your letters to FanView. I just thought all of that stuff was so superficial. I mean, here you had this team book, and everything was trying to be the X-Men in the heyday of Byrne and Claremont. But all it was, and it's funny, I talked to Michael Golden about this, all it was a bunch of pinups. Where they put captions and word balloons to try and create a story as they would go along. But everybody was angry. Everybody wanted to fight. Everybody was the witcher. Which, again, as an artist, I'm like, I can't do this. If this is what comic books are, I'm probably not going to do comic books for a living.
Yeah. You just summed up.
Never had college. You really.
No, that's no, because I love comics. I still read comics. And again, I was working at a comic shop, so I was seeing all of it. And me and my friend at the time, we were getting in a lot of British books. And this was before Watchmen had come out and all that. And we were seeing the artists and how they were doing stuff over there. And we thought, God, these guys have really got it. But their sales were low. You know, there wasn't anything like what DC and Marvel was doing at the time. Yeah, so we were very culture shocked because we had to adhere to a norm, but we really thought, man, this is what people should be looking at. You know, this is the work of Dave Gibbons and Steve Dillon, and all of these other guys who were novices at the time, at least in the United States. They were working in the UK. But here, of course, they went on to become superstars.
So then what was that turning point? Because you talk about you didn't like kind of what was the general theme that was happening. So at what point did you say, you know what, I put my toe in the water, I'm going to give this a shot?
I guess consistency is what it was. Again, I was working at a shop, so we would every now and again do a comic con, you know, and you just say, hey, we have too much inventory. Let's do a con and get rid of it all. So we would go there, and I'd just walk around and see what people were doing. And I think I find myself very fortunate to have started in the smaller companies because a lot of people are like, oh, well, don't you feel bad that you didn't get like an X-Men issue your first time out, and you could have been like this new superstar, breakout star? And I'm like, no, because the first thing I ever did, I thought looked awful. So the first thing I ever did has a published run of maybe 2,000. Whereas an X-Men book, you know, had over 100,000 copies. I'm going, no, I don't ever want to see this. I don't want to be here in another 25 years. I don't want people bringing up this title to me. And I've been pretty fortunate, but every once in a while, I started, like I said, at Caliber Comics. And they were trying to dip their toe into the arena and do superheroes, because Caliber was basically... they were adapting novels, and they just weren't doing any superhero stuff, essentially. And they started to do that. And I did something called Paradigm, which, I mean, a silly little book. I was friendly with the writer, creator, and he had this whole superhero line he wanted to immerse. And he convinced Caliber to publish it. And thankfully, it only went one issue. So,
Yeah. Nobody comes up to your table and says,
maybe every 4 years. That one, and Calloway was based in Michigan, so I try to stay away from it. Anybody Michigan shadows? Not no. And they're like, oh my God, I heard a box of them in DJ.
that's hilarious.
Nah,
Well, even going back to your, you know, when you started, you know, were you a comic fan when you were a young child?
So yeah.
Tell me just a little bit about that, like the early years, what got you interested and what got you to say to yourself at an early age, I want to do comic book art, and what that looked like.
well, I think like with most of us here, and you all seem to be of that age, I thought I couldn't understand why John Byrne couldn't draw every Marvel comic that had come out.
Right.
Because I just loved everything that he had done.
Yeah.
Everything. I was never... In high school, I'd never got into the X-Men so much. But as soon as he jumped on the Fantastic Four, that was my title. I was like, oh my God, who is this guy? And you know, what can I do to be part of it? I was just loving it. And I think I was, and quite thankfully, I was part of a renaissance in comics, because in high school, I was in high school in the early 80s, and that's when Frank Miller was doing Daredevil, and that's when George Perez and Marv Wolfman were doing Titans, and Walt Simonson was doing Thor, and all of these, the Fantastic Four by John Byrne, all of these amazing titles were just coming out. You know, there was no big fanfare. There was no, hey, we're going to do this massive 12-issue miniseries or maxi series, and it's going to be the reinvent comics. These were just regular titles that were coming out, and they were blowing me away. I literally, and this is, I guess, shows my age, I literally would go home after school, and there was a pharmacy store, and they sold comics in a rack, a spinning rack they had. And thankfully, I never understood how this guy kept his shop afloat, because he had all of his magazines and comics haphazardly. But today I thought back, oh God, I appreciate that he did that, because he had maybe 4 or 5 issues of Daredevil that, had I only brought the one, I don't know that I would have ever gone back and tried to find all of the earlier ones. And it was just such a saving grace for me that I could go to this place. And it wasn't even a comic shop. It was really literally a pharmacy. Yeah. And just pick up all of these back issues of these books that just happened to be sitting there. There was no fanfare. There was no, hey, you have to get this issue or anything like that. You know, which I think it was something that really didn't happen until the Watchmen started to become popular. back in the day that sort of thing really took flight. So, I mean, hell, even what Frank Miller and Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One was within his own series. It wasn't a separate entity where, hey, you have to get this, and it was a big deal. I didn't even know how many issues it was because it was following concurrently with the Batman title.
You know what was so fantastic about Byrne and Miller in those times' work? They created like a sense of motion in the panel.
Mm-hmm.
They were really good at that. Like it felt like things were moving in the panel. You weren't looking, like you said, it wasn't just pen up word bubbles. It was like it flowed. It looked like action. You could almost picture it like a motion picture.
Well, as an artist, nothing floored me in very much the same way than when they started to, Epic started to produce Akira. The first time we Westerners were allowed to see that sort of manga, that to me was movement in comics. I was amazed at I later learned it wasn't just one guy. He had a whole studio, all that, sure. But man, the storytelling on that book, well, even today, I look at it and think, this is amazing. This is why we should study manga, not so much the style or the cutesy-ness of it all, which I get it, and it has its place. But as a serious contributor to the field of comics, I think that's where they gave us so much more than most people say.
Yeah, absolutely. With the and with the titles that you've been able to work on, because you've got like Buffy, obviously Mandalorian, and some other titles like that. Which one of those titles that are from an IP has been your favorite, or was like a dream project to work on?
Funny enough, as you're growing up and you're a kid, you're like, oh my God, I would have loved to have done the Raiders of the Lost Ark comic adaptation. The Star Trek Wrath of Khan comics adaptation. You would have loved to have done that thing. And more as I took off in the comic field, I never thought I was ever going to do any IPs whatsoever, because it was at that point too, Marvel was kind of lessening their hold on IPs, and they just weren't doing them anymore. And the idea of a movie adaptation was no longer really a big thing that people wanted to see, because they had so many things, and the internet was becoming more popular. I thought, well, I guess that's it. I'm never going to do an adaptation of an IP ever again. And then play it out. Buffy comes around. And like I was saying earlier to the gentleman who was here, I had been doing this one book for Wildstorm, and it's funny how one job will lead to another. So never put down anything you're doing, because you never know who's watching it at the time. And the book I was doing was called The American Way, which was a fictionalized book on superheroes in the 60s that John F. Kennedy actually sanctioned, basically a team like the Avengers in the 60s. And Joss Whedon apparently was reading that book, and at that time, apparently, he was like, hey, Buffy had been off the air for a few years. Hey, I'm feeling a little nostalgic. I want to do more Buffy. And it's those two things collided together that allowed me to come into that world. And very much the same way I did Firefly for Joss as well. And that was more of a, hey, I know you've been on Buffy for a while. Would you mind coming over and doing some Firefly? And, these questions where people are like, oh my God, I wish somebody would ask me that. They were just coming my way more and more. And even with the Mandalorian, this was around COVID, when COVID started to hit, and everybody was hurting at COVID. There was just no work. It wasn't that you didn't have work. It just was that work wasn't being produced. The paper companies weren't making paper. The companies weren't going into the offices. So it wasn't that you didn't have a job. There just wasn't a job to have, essentially. Yeah. And especially with comics. And I got this one mini series of an X-Men book called The Extinction. And it was supposed to be this alternate universe where all the bad X-Men were now good X-Men. And in this universe, they were the peacekeepers and all. It's kind of a silly concept. And they discounted it almost as soon as the series wrapped up. But from there, the assistant editor was one of the editors to Star Wars. One of the assistant editors of Star Wars said, hey, we need some fill-ins to The High Republic, which was a Star Wars book they were doing. Would you mind coming over? And of course, you never want to seem like you're desperate. So you're kind of like, well, I'll check my schedule, see what's going on. But of course, in your head, you're going, oh my God, tell me when I can start, as I am dying. And from there, the Mandalorian, I was told, I don't know how, how stories get around, but I was told somebody already had the Mandalorian. and they had to back out. And my editor, my assistant editor, was also the editor on Star Wars High Republic. So he says, hey, I have this book. Are you interested? It's 8 issues. We don't know really what's going to happen with it. Would you be interested in doing it? And I thought, oh my God, yeah, I just watched that show. I love that. Sure. So things like that happen all the time. And I guess that serendipity in my career for sure has always been the case. And I've never questioned it once.
Don't look that and don't look that.
That gift horse in the mouth.
Fantastic.
So speaking of kind of, you don't want to seem desperate to, and put yourself in that position. But are there projects that you've seen that you just knew you would be like an ultimate fit for, or maybe something that you want to do, but just haven't had that opportunity?
I have been very fortunate to be counseled by wise men and also to listen to their counsel. Around that time in Buffy, this was 2007 when Joss had gotten the script. Dark Horse had already been publishing Buffy for years. They had been doing it concurrently with the TV show, which went off the air in 2004. So they already had books, but technically they would never canon. And it wasn't until, and funny enough, Joss had never written an issue before. It wasn't until Joss came on that they started to become canon. From there, I was approached by Dark Horse asking me would I like to draw Buffy. And at that time, I'd never even seen an episode. I was aware of Buffy in pop culture, but I was never influenced by Buffy. I never watched it. And so I was kind of like, it's not superhero. I think that's the first thing we say to ourselves. But that's not a superhero. I want a superhero. Does she have a shield? Exactly. But at that time, DC was offering me Flash. Mark Waid was going to reintroduce Flash into this wasn't 52 yet or anything like that. They were just sort of reintroducing the Flash, and I thought, that's what I want to do. That's a superhero. Come on. And Scott Alley, who was the editor over at Dark Horse at the time, who had edited all of the Buffy and he'd done Hellboy, a bunch of other books. He really, again, wise sage, and gave me counsel that I was even wiser to listen to. He told me, look, everybody has done the Flash at some point. Bunches of artists over its, 50, 60-year history have done the Flash. You will never be known as the artist of the Flash. You do Buffy, you're going to be known as the artist for Buffy from here on. And of course, I don't have that knowledge that he has of knowing any of this. I just take his word, and something, it's one of those things, something into it said, you know what, you're right, let me do this. Because Dark Horse wasn't even sure. It quickly became the #1 selling book. Dark Horse had never even done royalties before because they just didn't sell that many books. And Buffy was giving out royalties in spades. And it was one of those things that I am so glad I good.
Well, and that ended up, maybe you were going to bring it up, but that ended up in the Eisner Award.
And then it ended up, we won an Eisner for Best Title.
So now you're editor. Do that. I told you so.
Believe me, I think I gave him
the Eisner for the Flash.
He asked for a cover or something. And he's like, how much you want for the cover? I'm like, you don't want to care. You just take that. I probably owe you a what?
George's work on the Eisner ring. Without knowing about it,
I can charge it for it. The beauty is I know a lot of stories about other people.
Well, Georges, before we do wrap up, though, where could people go and find more about your work, keep up with all the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. I have a website. It's called Kaba Lounge, KABALOUNGE.com. And that's where all of my artwork and social media stuff is usually. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and all of that good stuff. So I'm very accessible, is what I try to tell people. And if you ever want to get a hold of me, it doesn't take more than 48 hours for me to get back to you.
There we go. And just for our viewers and listeners, we'll have all the links in the show notes so you can go and see what his latest projects are and get your hands on some of these things. He has links to the Caliber comments.
Do I? No, I don't. That's something that I should be talking to my guy. And I'm actually very proud of it, but I'm one of those things. You look at it, and you're like, no, I'm so much better than that.
everybody had to get their start.
And everybody had to get their start. I don't begrudge it.
I mean, I had you seen like Alex Ross now was showing like his drawings at like 9 years old and what he does now, and you're like,
I was working at this. I think it's one of his first things with Terminator. He did Terminator for I can't remember the company, but we were looking at this guy going, this guy's got some chops here. He's going somewhere.
I don't know how he does it, but Lou, thanks for being here today.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it. Fantastic guest. I mean, great stories. We really appreciate your work. Appreciate you being ours.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thanks again for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell so we can keep bringing you content like this. And we'll see you on the next one.